All right, if you remember yesterday, what we did was we went over Chapter 10. All right, and as I mentioned to you, at the end of the period, I passed or emailed you the homework in the labs for Chapters 10 through 16. We are going to look at 11 through 16, or at least 11 and 12, a little bit later. Today, the idea is we go over Chapter 11 and we go over Chapter 12. Chapter 11 is on images. Much of the material that's in here you've already had. What you're going to find too in this chapter and the next chapter is occasionally they'll mention things and they'll say, as of this writing. And you got to realize this is, I think, a 2019 book, which means it was written in 2018, which means that it's almost 3 years old, right? So there's things in there that are no longer true. So we'll fact check, so to speak, a couple of the things that are in there. All right, so the Chapter 11, the one we'll cover first, as it says, is working with images and icons. The first thing they talk about in there are the different kinds of images. All right, how to include an image on a page, guess what? You already know that. All right, resizing an image, there's different ways that this can be done. We'll talk about that. Aligning an image vertically, that becomes important, and they have a pretty good graphic in the chapter of when you've got an image and you've got text right next to it, and maybe the image is a little bit bigger than the text is, so you want the text to kind of align up right with the middle of the image. Those are just little things that, you know, sometimes can make a website look more professional, okay? A lot of people won't even notice if you do it or you don't do it. Finally, well, there's that word again, float. And you can float images. We've talked about that. You've actually done that. All right. Then we go into some advanced skills. Now, notice that on page 400 here, that's a brand new, when I say brand new, it's an HTML5 tag. You don't have to use that. However, the reason that you might want to use both a fig caption tag and a figure tag is it helps people who are sight impaired, because remember, HTML5 tags are designed to be semantic. So a browser, especially a browser for the blind, can look at that and in a much easier way figure out what's going on. All right, and it's recommended that you do that. How to use the picture element, we'll go over that. They go over a real, I'm not going to say that this is the best way of putting it, but it's the way I'll use, kind of a cheesy way to do image rollovers. We may have talked about image rollovers before, we may not have, but you know, one of the more famous ones I remember seeing years ago, there, you know, you'd go out to like jennycraig.com and they'd have a before picture and you'd put your mouse on the person and they would be 100 pounds lighter. You take your mouse out, they would be 100 pounds heavier again. That's a rollover. There's a lot of different ways you can do rollovers. A lot of times they're done with images. Sometimes they're done, for example, with background colors. All right, if you want to show something is dangerous, that maybe when they mouse over something, you turn the background image red. That kind of an idea. When it's good, you turn the background image green, because there's connotations with those words. All right. Image maps, I think I've got an example here for you. The best example I can think of, there's two of them for image maps. One is that if you've ever gone out to a thing of the United States, like a map of the United States, and you, for example, you click on Missouri, and it shows you the home page for the state of Missouri. That kind of an idea. That's an image map. All right, you could go and click on Illinois, you could click on Arkansas, etc., and get those pages. That kind of an idea. The other one that's used quite often is when you see people who are medical students, where they'll have a picture of the human body. All right, and they can click on different areas. So if you were studying the meniscus in the knee, for example, you could find out about that by clicking on that part of the knee, etc. All right, then some related skills. When to use an image editor. Well, there are free image editors and there are not free image editors. All right, the one they'll recommend that you use in here, if you want to go in and play with images yourself, it's called GIMP, G-I-M-P. It's not bad. I've played with it before. I'm not going to say it's fantastic. It's not good as, for example, using something like Photoshop that you'd pay for. It's much easier to sit in a line and do different things with images in a package like that. But GIMP is not bad. How to get images. The key thing here, I've given you a couple things. I talked about unsplash.com with you. Those have got free images in there. I've recommended that when you do that, typically at the bottom, they ask you to give a little bit of thank you for the person. Jeff Scott provided this image for unsplash.com. That's the kind of thing that I might add to an alt tag, all right, to give the person some attribution. I might just say, image of a dog, provided by, that kind of thing, all right. The other place was pexels.com, Pexels.com. You can go out to Google Images. Sometimes you have to watch out when you go to Google Images because there will be things in there, and we'll talk about some of the stuff in there about common law and a few other things when we get to that section. How to get and work with icons and Fabicons, we've talked about that already. All right, so we're not going to spend much time on that. Finally, the last part in there is with SVG, Scalable Vector Graphics, and that can be very important depending upon the type of graphic that you're using. All right, because a lot of times SVG graphics can be a lot more detailed. They can be a lot better. They can grow and shrink better than a typical image will, etc. We'll take a look at all that in just a minute. Not a particularly long chapter. Okay, so the first thing they talk about in here, and I don't want to read this to you, but they talk about JPEG images. JPEG are always saved as either .jpg or .jpeg. And it'll say in here, it's like joint photographic something or other. I don't know what it is. You can look it up. It's not that big a thing. But notice what they say in here. They lose information when they're compressed. So if you try to take an image and make it smaller, the good news is with a JPEG is typically, all right, they'll allow you to use a lot of colors, show a lot of detail, but as you start to compress it, some of those colors will go away and some of that detail will go away. All right, and it doesn't support transparency. So if you want to use opacity basically within that, it doesn't work well. I'm not saying it doesn't work, it doesn't work well. All right. GIFs are old. That's the old way of doing things. GIFs typically are used today for things like word art or very simple, if you've got a very simple logo. So let's say that, I had a company called Triangle Inc. And my image was a red triangle or a green triangle or whatever. That might be a good thing for a GIF. One thing that you can do with GIFs is that you can use them for animations. All right, you may or may not have seen stuff like this already. I mean, you can see real simple stuff. I always go back because I think it's funny. I remember as a kid, maybe you did this, that you had a little paperback book, and on all the pages, you started maybe on the last page, and you made it like a little rocket. You made it so when you flipped through the book, the rocket would either go up in the air or it would go down. That's a pretty simple, crude animation, and you can do a lot of that stuff with GIFs. All right. They can be compressed without losing information, and they can be made, for transparencies. Now, many years ago, I don't know how many, probably 10, 20 years ago, they came up with PNGs. And PNGs, PNG, it's portable network graphic. The idea behind PNGs is they were supposed to combine the best of all worlds. All right, so they were, you could do animation and some other things, a lot of color support, like you had with GIFs, and they wouldn't lose, unlike JPEGs, they wouldn't lose a lot of information when you change them internally. Okay? And now there's a new one, new in the last few years, and that's WebP. WebP is, as it says, it's the newest type developed by Google. Now it says in there, currently, they're only supported by Chrome and Opera. I can go out to caniuse.com because I did it yesterday. You can do it yourselves and type in WebP. It's basically supported on all modern browsers now, WebP WebP images, just so you know that. All right. So you want more, you can get it right there. Okay. Notice with GIFs, 256 colors. I think with JPEG it's like 17 million. Big difference. All right. Notice with WebP2, 26% smaller than PNG files, 25 to 34% smaller than JPEG. That's advantageous because if you have a website that has a lot of images that have to load, they'll load faster if they're smaller. So there's some JPEGs, there's again some GIFs, and you can read this yourselves, okay? All right, so how to include an image on a page? Well, you already know this stuff. One thing I've mentioned to you, I'm saying it again right now, do not include in your HTML, so in your image tag, do not ever include height and width. If for some reason you need to include height and width, put them in your CSS. Because otherwise what you're doing again is you are integrating the CSS right into your HTML, which isn't considered to be a good idea. All right? Now, yes, of course, you must put a source tag in there. That makes sense. Otherwise, it won't find it. And it's more, it used to be just the recommendation was to use an alt tag. Depending on the type of site you work for, I mean, if you work, for example, for a governmental site, you have to, in your images, you need an alt tag. Because there will be a certain percentage of the population who are going to go out to that website who cannot see. They need the alt tag to provide them that information. The other thing the alt tag provides for you, and we've talked about this before, is if for some reason the image doesn't exist or you've given it a wrong path, the alt is what will come up on the screen. All right. There's other things that you can add in here as well. There's a title tag that you can add. There's a tooltip that you can add. I think you've all seen tooltips when you put your mouse over something and it gives you a little tooltip above it or on the side, whatever, maybe even below it as to what that is involved there. All right. So we talked about height and width already. Again, I'm not going to talk about those. Now, notice here they talk about CSS for resizing images. There are different ways to resize images. All right. Typically, if you come in there and you set the max width to 100% and maybe the height to auto, it'll automatically reset itself. Okay. There are times when you try to shove 10 pounds worth into a 5-pound bag, so to speak, that if you scrunch an image down too much and you've got it, or you go in there yourself, let's say in your CSS, and you change these numbers, all right, to what they really were not set up for. If you do that, you can make something look very weird. All right, I just want to show you quickly, and I mean quickly, an example of that. So here we go. This is what I'm working on, or one of the things that we're working on in the other class. Now, if you look in here, I've got, this is just a little, I'll show you that in a minute. But if I open up this right here, this is an image of Wall Street, literally a picture of Wall Street. All right, and you can see how big it is. I actually shrunk it down, believe it or not, because when I loaded it, it was like 5,000 pixels by 4,000 pixels or something like that. I shrunk it down to 2,000 times 133. When you do this, if you decide you're going to shrink down the size, I think I've shown you this before, but I'm trying to be complete here, you click Resize right here. And notice you can use percentages, which have never used. I always go to pixels. And you can see that it's now 2,000 by 1333. Let's suppose, for whatever reason, I wanted this to be 2,000 by 2,000. Then I'd have to come in here and literally click where it says Maintain Aspect Ratio. I'd have to uncheck that. Now I can put in 2,000. And when I do and I click OK, it's distorted now. You can see that. All right, so I'm going to come back in here again, and I'm going to do another resize, and I'm going to go over to here again, and I'm going to make sure this is maintained now. And I put in 2,000, and you notice it kept the old one. All right, well, I want it back to where it was before. Okay, and click OK, and now it's back to the way that it was. Now, another thing in here too, because I've seen this before, and I've worked with this, and I've had problems with this. Let's say that I manually wanted to go in here myself. Pardon my French, but I'm coming in here and I'm saying, you know what, just kind of screw. I want to create a Fabicon. I want it to be 32 by 32, and I don't want to play with this. I don't want to go out to the internet. I don't want to do diddly. Do you understand what I'm saying? I just want to do it like that. Well, notice if I come in here to File, and I go down to Properties, and I come in here and I change this to 32, and I change this to 32, see what happened? So I could save that right now and use that if I wanted to as a Fabicon. All right, it's just another way of doing it. It's not really the recommended way of doing it. The recommended way is to go out to a free site and actually set it up like that. It's scaled correctly, and there's some internal stuff that may not be being done here. I don't know. All right, and I don't want to save this. Okay, but if you look here, this one says 2000 by 1333. So does this one. So does this one. And so does this one. But if you look at this one, and I don't like the way this came out at all, whoops, don't want that. No, that's fine. But if I come over here and I right mouse click and I choose open with and paint, it is a little bit distorted. It's too wide basically and not tall enough. So when I grabbed these 4 images, they weren't the same size originally. The other 3 were the same size. This one wasn't. So it does look a little bit distorted. It's not terrible. All right. And I probably could go in there and use GIMP or another package and try to pretty it up or whatever. I don't know. So you can read this stuff yourselves. One thing I want you to be very attuned to, though, is these accessibility guidelines. You should be thinking about that stuff whenever you build anything. All right. Notice to display an image at a size other than its full size, you can use CSS for height and width. Better, though, is to use an image editor. And I've just showed you Paint. That was about the simplest way of doing it. All right. Aligning vertically, I mentioned this to you already. Notice there's a vertical align property that you can use with images. You can align things to the bottom, to the middle, to the top, to the text bottom, to the text top. And if you look at the example, this one isn't terrible. None of these are terrible. But note the difference between here where it's aligned to text bottom and here where it's aligned center. All right? This is the kind of thing that probably 9 people out of 10 aren't even going to realize that it's set one way or the other. Now, that 10th person may be the person you're working for and you're doing the site for. Right? As it says here, if you use pixels, points, or ems to specify the value for the vertical align, the image is raised if the value is positive, and it's lowered if it's negative. If you specify a percent, the image is raised or lowered on the percentage of the height of the line. Again, when possible, you shouldn't use pixels and points for the reason we've already talked about. And hopefully what you're starting to see is as we got into the responsiveness in chapters 8, 9, and 10, using pixels and points can start to wreak some havoc when you go down, especially to a small phone size. All right, but using percentages, ems, and even better, rems and percentages tend to work a lot better. All right. You can use margins, padding, and border with images, and you oftentimes do. All right, floating, we've talked about this already, so you know that you can float to the left. You know that you can float to the right. So here's an example of coming in and floating to the left. If you do no floating right there, an image is what's known as, it's an inline element, but the stuff will, when you put it in an image tag, typically that'll be by itself, and this code, this stuff that you see here would be down below it. All right. You can fill that up with other things. There's a lot of ways that you can handle that. All right. This, in my opinion, for whatever that is or is not worth, looks a little bit more professional. As it says, you use the same techniques for floating an image that you do for floating text and all the other stuff that we've talked about before. All right. So when you look on here, this right here where it says Scott Sampson and friend, that actually is a fig caption. It's a caption or a figure. This has now been put into a figure tag, and inside of the figure tag is the image and the figure caption or fig caption. This is the way it's recommended that you set this stuff up because, again, those are HTML5 semantic tags. All right, so you'll notice you've got figure, then your image tag, then fig caption inside of there. All right, you can go in and use CSS on the figure and or on the fig caption. And you can read this yourselves. All right, how to use the picture element. This is a little bit different because when you look at it right here, this is almost like we're using a media query. Because what it's saying here is, hey, I'm going to put a picture in, okay, and if the width is 960 pixels or above, we're going to use Mountains 1. If it's 768 to 959, we're going to use Mountains 2. If it's 460 to 767, we're going to use Mountains 3. Otherwise, we're going to use Mountains 4. All right. You could do the same effect, basically, just by using a media query if you wanted to do that. So as it says, this picture element provides more flexibility. All right. It holds two types of child elements, one or more source elements, and an image element. The browser at runtime will evaluate the information to determine the image to display. So the browser is smart enough that it knows its width, and based on its current width, it's going to display one of those 4 mountain images. All right, rollovers we've already talked about. When we get into the second part of the class and we talk about jQuery, you'll find out then that there are better ways to do rollovers. Because with jQuery, what you might want to do for a rollover, as an example, is you might have the first image fade out and the second image fade in. Well, jQuery has got a fade out and a fade in method. All right, so you'll see how to use that when we get to that point. In here, what they're saying is the image has been rolled over because the mouse is hovering over it. So what they've done here is notice that it says image 1 is going to show H1. However, when you hover over image 1, it's going to change to H2. So as it says, when you use this method, the first background image is applied to the block element like a paragraph. The second is displayed when the mouse hovers over it. All right, image maps. Already mentioned these to you, but I want to show you. I don't remember if let's see. One day in class, this is, believe it or not, it says here 2018. It's older than that. This is probably 10 years old. I was just screwing around one day. The class had a lab, and I didn't really have anything to do exactly. So I made this. All right, and I know it's not much. There's almost no CSS on it. All right, but you'll notice that, if, for instance, if I take and put my mouse down here, nothing happens. If I put it on Washington and I click, well, it's supposed to be George Washington. That's how old this is, because I've got to fix the link. But if you look here, it says whitehouse.gov/history/presidents/gw1.html. So evidently that's changed. But you get the idea. If I put it over here, probably another error, but it'll say TJ3 for Thomas Jefferson. Now, when you set up these image maps, what you may or may not have noticed is when I take my mouse and I put it there, it was like a little rectangle. In this case, over Teddy Roosevelt. But when I put it over Washington, it was a rectangle too, but not everything is hit there. So in other words, with Washington, if I put my mouse here, it's not grabbing it. When you set this up, when you set up an image map, there's basically 3 types of units that you can use. You can use something that's circular or elliptical. You can use something that's a square or a rectangle, or the one I should have used in here and didn't, which is a polygon, which you can kind of draw your own shape. All right? And again, you'll notice for Lincoln, same kind of thing. All right. Also, when you look in here, well, that doesn't look real good, does it? Should have been moving down, but it's not. Did the back to top work? Yeah, that works. All right. That's enough of that. So, as it says here, when you're working with an image map, I mean, this is the example they give. I don't know. I guess they're pushing their own books. But when you look here, notice map. So the image map is between map tags. You give the map a name, especially if you want to style it. All right, but in this case, it's just name equals. All right, one thing I've mentioned this to you before, I'm going to say it again. in this class that you're in right now, AWD1000, it's important that we give things that we want to style, things that we want to program, be able to manipulate programmatically, an ID. When you get on, because we're on the client side, when you get on the server side, a year from now, the name property is what's important. All right, so the name property is basically used with server-side programming. All right, so we're setting up the area here. You'll notice that it says that it's a polygon. All right, just like you do for an image, Alt equals. And then you give it a title, and then you've got to give it coordinates. All right, there are actually tools that you can use to kind of graph this for you, and it'll show you what the coordinates should be. All right. So as it says, you can use the map and area elements to define an image map that provides clickable areas. These clickable areas are typically known as hotspots. The coordinates are relative to the upper left corner of the image, and they're measured. In this case, they are always done in pixels. That's what these numbers are. All right. Image editors, I mentioned GIMP to you before. If you bring up, I haven't used GIMP probably in about a year. But when you bring up an image in GIMP, it pretty much looks like this. It's a very standard looking piece of software, not pretty at all, but you can go in there and play with it. All right. You can do some stuff in there that would be very hard, if not impossible, to do with what I showed you in Paint a couple minutes ago. All right, so there's a few things that you can do in here. One thing that I have found is the reason that I showed you Paint is when I uncheck that box, I can basically change the proportionality in there. It's much harder to do that unless they've changed it in the last year in GIMP. Typically, if you change, if you've got an image that's 500 by 500, and if for some reason you want it by 500 by 200, GIMP is not the thing to use. All right. So here's some of the stuff you can do. I'm not going to read these to you. There's other ones too. All right, notice Adobe Photoshop Elements, an inexpensive editor. Well, that means that it's not free. All right, GIMP we already mentioned, and Photoshop is the leader. It's the best. So if you were going to, let's say you were going to become a web developer / designer, and you were going to hang a shingle out of your own house and, and have angieshelton.com, all right, you'd probably want to get the Adobe suite of products. And they show the difference here with transparency as opposed to, and it says, and the matte. Well, you can look at it, you can see the difference. All right, how to get images. Some of this I've already mentioned to you, but if you look on here, this is the important thing, this Creative Commons license. All right, if it talks about a Creative Commons license, read this. Notice it says attribution. You can use the images derived as long as you give credit as requested by the author. So they're free to use. But if you do not put in there, permission granted by, whatever, or something like that, and typically they'll have a way they want you to set it up. I've already mentioned the way they do it on unsplash.com. All right. Share alike, as it says, you can distribute the image based on the license that governs the original work. Non-commercial, you can use it, as it says, for non-commercial purposes only. The good news is, if we're doing something here and it's homework, the chances of somebody ever coming after you for putting something like that in there are virtually, there's zero. That said, you create this really cool looking site, you decide, you know what, I'm putting that out on the internet. You know how to use GitHub Pages now, and there's other things that you can use. We're using Heroku, which is another free editor or a free uploader that we're using in the other class. If somebody sees that and you're supposed to give them attribution or it's non-commercial, they can come after you for that. All right, and then no derivative works. You can only use the original images and not the images derived from it. The bottom line is this. If you decide that you want to go and use images, all right, and you're working for a company and you want to use images and you're not sure whether or not you have the right to do that, you'll talk to your legal department. All right, and you say, well, what if we don't have a legal department? At a minimum then, if you look online and you say this is a cool image and you can't find anything out about it, try to find out who owns it, send them an email and ask for permission to use it. And if they give it to you, don't get rid of that email. They give you some other sites. These are not the ones, that I've shown you. All right, but there's some, there's plenty of them out there. Finally, the chapter ends here with how to get and work with icons. Now, we have not done much with these, but we're going to. We're going to look at using Font Awesome. All right, I know I've shown you that before. We've looked at it a little bit. Some of the things that are often used in Font Awesome, and I didn't put these in that WeSom thing that we did, but what if WeSom had a Facebook page, had a LinkedIn page, had an Instagram page? Font Awesome has icons for all of those. And typically that's put down in the footer. Not always, but a lot of times down in the footer. All right, let's see. I don't even know. If I go to rankin.edu here and I go down to the bottom of the page, there they are on the left-hand side. All right. Again, everybody sets them up differently, and it's whatever you're looking for. Now, next week, as I mentioned, we're going to do some work with Bootstrap. This isn't that big a thing, but I just want to mention it to you. Back in Bootstrap 3, which is probably 5 to 10 years ago, something like that, Bootstrap had their own icons that you used. They were called glyphicons. Okay? And what they did when they went to Bootstrap 4 was they said, they dropped all their glyphicons. They said, just use Font Awesome. They're more standard, etc. All right? But you can see there's other ones that you can use as well. Notice Font Awesome, I bet you that number is probably well over 1,000 now. And I also mentioned to you that with Font Awesome, there's both a free tier, which is what most people use, and there's a paid tier, which is somewhere around $50 a year. All right, but it gives you, access to all the images they have. Here's typically, again, how you load Font Awesome. I already showed you that cdnjs.com, where you can go and get CDNs, content delivery networks, from basically anywhere. You can go in there and grab the Font Awesome, and it'll always give you the most up-to-date one. All right. Again, you should use the common symbols. All right. You shouldn't say, hey, you know what? My email, I'm going to do this or I'm going to do that. All right. And don't put a phone for your email, for example. It sounds silly, but people occasionally do things. I just thought it was neat to do that. Creating Fabicons, again, we've already talked about this. Okay. And this is typically it doesn't matter whether this goes above or below the rest of your or your CSS files. All right, and you know what a Fabicon is. Everybody should by now. By default, it's typically named Fabicon.ico. All right, doesn't have to be, but usually it is. There's some programs. There's some other ones that I've shown you as well. Finally, the last thing in the chapter is this SVG, or Scalar Vector Graphic. Notice it says it's used to create 2D graphics that use XML, which is the extensible markup language. All right. As it says, because these graphics are scalable, they're ideal for responsive web design. Because they don't have to be loaded into a web page from the server, they'll load faster. All right. And they show you some of the stuff about SVG set up in here. All right. A lot of people, when you've got a very intricate type of logo, they like to use these. All right. They show you how they set their, that's the Muroc logo right there. Okay. And they give you a thing, as always, they're pushing you off to the Mozilla developer site if you want to find out more about that. All right. So that is chapter 11. Okay. Before we go on to 12, which we're going to do in just a couple minutes, but what I sent you yesterday, where did I put it? Hopefully I put it in here and kept it. I just quickly, and I mean very quickly, would like to take a minute or two and go over, make sure that everybody is clear on what you're supposed to be doing for the homework. We looked at 10 already, so let's look at 11 and 12. All right. So here's the labs. So the lab for chapter 11. Again, I'm not making excuses. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it, but either Mr. Gudmested or Mr. Smith wrote these. Okay, so it says for chapter 11, create a web page that includes a few different kind of images. At least one animated GIF. You say, I don't know how to do that. Just look up, just basically Google animated GIFs. At least one JPEG, at least one PNG, at least one SVG. Use the image elements to include all of those elements. Try working with a picture. Okay, and let's just leave it right there. We'll look at 12 after we get done talking about tables in a few minutes. All right, so, okay, for some reason that's only the labs. I don't know where the homework is. I'll do it like this. So this was the homework. I threw out that quiz because you're doing the written ones. All right. So this was the chapter 11. All right. Use a grid layout to create a page layout with a header, 3 columns, and a footer, and basically add a figure caption. Okay. Put a picture in there. Do an image rollover. I would just follow right what's in the chapter. This isn't something that you're necessarily going to ever want to publish, but the idea is for you to get a comfort level with these different things that are in here. All right. So look through those when and as you get a chance, and of course, if you have a question, please ask. All right. Any questions on anything we just went over in that chapter? All right. It is 8:41.